Get away from that bed. Rourke Vaughn never had to raise his voice. 37 years old, black overcoat still buttoned, hands in his pockets, standing in the private wing of the most expensive women's hospital on the East Coast, like a man who owned the floor. He did. You push a cart, you change linens. I flew 14 doctors into this building, Johns Hopkins, Cleveland Clinic, Cedars-Sinai, 14 of the best in America. And you walk in smelling like disinfectant, in a $12 rental uniform, and you think you've got something to say. Nell Brannigan didn't say a word. 29 years old, $280 in her checking account. Her eyes never went to Rourke Vaughn, the man half of New York couldn't look at directly. They stayed on the monitor above the bed. On one number, nobody else in that room was reading correctly. On that bed, his sister was 24 years old, 34 weeks pregnant, and slipping away. 14 of the finest physicians in the country were arguing 3 feet from her body, and not one of them agreed with another. Not one of them was right. Security, Rourke said. 2 men took Nell by the arms. Her leather notebook hit the marble and fell open, cracked cover, handwriting so dense it looked like code. It landed on page 61. Nobody picked it up. They should have, because what was written in those creases cost $40, sat in the supply cabinet of every hospital in this country, and was the only thing on earth that could keep that girl and her unborn daughter alive. Not one of those 14 doctors knew it, and they didn't know something else either. They had no idea who that night shift technician actually used to be. She'd been working the basement of that building for 18 months, not waiting for a promotion, waiting for a patient she'd never met. This is the story of the woman they never should have thrown out of that room, of what she did next, something nobody in that hallway saw coming, and nobody who watched it has ever forgotten, and of a man who gave orders to an entire city, who had to learn to say 2 words he'd never said to anyone in his life. If this story pulls you in, hit that like button. It really does help us reach more people. Share it with someone who's ever been judged by the uniform they wear. And subscribe, because the next story might be the one you needed to hear. Now let's go back to that corridor, 12:47 in the morning, where a woman with a supply cart is about to say 1 word out loud and change everything. People didn't fear Rourke Vaughn because he raised his voice. They feared him because he never needed to. At 37, he stood at the head of Hollis Group, a name that sounded as harmless as any real estate company in Manhattan, with offices on the 41st floor, a human resources department, and an annual Christmas party with white wine and soft jazz. On paper, Hollis bought old warehouses along the waterfront and turned them into apartments. In reality, not a single container traveled the East Coast route from Newark to Providence without someone in that building knowing what was inside it. Rourke didn't consider that a crime. He considered it logistics. He had the kind of memory that made other people uneasy. He remembered the name of every wife married to every man who worked for him, remembered which child had braces, remembered who had lost a mother the previous winter, and sent flowers on the exact anniversary of her death. But the people who opposed him didn't have names. They had numbers. He called them by the final 4 digits of their file codes, and whenever he referred to someone by a number, Cormac Deal knew that person was no longer a human being, only a line waiting to be dealt with. Cormac was 44 and had been beside him for 19 years. He was the only person in Rourke's life who dared to say no. It wasn't because he was braver than anyone else. It was because he had been there on the night. Rourke was 19. When the only 2 adults in the young man's life died on Route 21, and left him with a funeral bill, a rented apartment in Bay Ridge, and a 6-year-old sister sitting on the front steps, clutching her school bag and waiting for someone to come pick her up. No one came. Rourke did. From that night forward, every calculation in his life contained one constant: Maeve. He paid for piano lessons because she loved them. He sent her to a good school because she deserved it. He bought her an apartment in Cobble Hill with south-facing windows because she said the afternoon sunlight made the piano keys feel warm. At 24, Maeve Vaughn taught piano to 11 children in the neighborhood, tied her hair back with an elastic band, and knew nothing about the things that paid for her piano. Not entirely nothing. She knew her brother was wealthy. She knew he said he worked in real estate. She knew the men standing outside the car whenever he came for Sunday dinner weren't drivers. One evening 3 years earlier, when she was 21 and not yet pregnant, Rourke was washing dishes in her kitchen, and she opened her mouth to ask, Then she looked at his back, at the shoulders of the man who had raised her since she was 6 years old, and closed her mouth again. She hadn't asked since. There are questions people don't leave unasked because they fear the answer. They leave them unasked because they fear that once they've heard the truth, they won't know how to love that person in the same way anymore. Adric Sloan was her husband. He was 30, a structural engineer working for a contractor that held an agreement with Hollis Group. He died 5 months earlier in a construction accident in Red Hook. One falling beam, one 14-page report, and an insurance payment settled within 9 days. Rourke sat beside his sister throughout the funeral and didn't speak a single word for 4 hours. Maeve was 3 months pregnant at the time. She cried so hard that she had to be given intravenous fluids. Rourke held her hand while the needle went in, and there was nothing at all on his face. Cormac stood at the far end of the funeral home hallway that day and saw the only thing that had ever sent a chill through him in 19 years. He didn't see Rourke grieving. He saw Rourke calculating. The baby was a girl. Maeve found out during the 18th week and told her brother over the phone, her voice rising like a child's, and Rourke had to leave the conference room so he could listen to every word. He didn't renovate a room in his own home. He bought the entire 4th floor of a building across the park, close to her apartment, so that if anything happened, it would take him only 8 minutes to reach her on foot. He calculated in minutes. He always calculated in minutes. During the 34th week, Maeve collapsed while teaching piano to a 9-year-old boy. The boy was the one who called for an ambulance. Inside the ambulance, her blood pressure fell so low that the paramedic had to call dispatch and confirm that the monitor wasn't malfunctioning. By the time she reached the hospital, she was no longer conscious. And over the next 11 hours, Rourke Vaughn did what he had always done with every problem in his life. He threw money at it until it surrendered. He called 14 people. Not one of them refused. People didn't refuse him. He gave them rooms, gave them cars, gave them everything they requested, and stood outside the hospital room, waiting for them to bring him an answer. 3 days passed. A council of the most celebrated medical minds in the country stood beneath the same roof, and not one of these experts could bring him a single word other than perhaps. That was the one thing Rourke couldn't calculate. He could buy anything. But he had never learned how to buy an answer from people who simply didn't have one. Ashcroft Ellery Women's Institute stood between 5th Avenue and the park, an 8-story limestone building that looked more like a private library from the outside than a place where people came to give birth. Lobby floor was paved with travertine, stone quarried from a mine in Tuscany, and fitted together so that the veins ran without interruption from the revolving doors to the elevators. There was no coffee machine in the 6th floor waiting room. There was a barista named Dimitri who arrived at 6 o'clock every morning, and he remembered what everyone drank. It was the kind of detail that made families feel safe, and safety was the most expensive thing this hospital sold. By the 3rd day, no one was drinking Dimitri's coffee anymore. The consultation room on the 6th floor had become something no one at Ashcroft Ellery had ever seen before, a room filled with exceptionally capable people, none of whom dared to speak the final word. The meeting was led by Priscilla Hartigan, 49 years old, a maternal fetal medicine specialist with 19 years of experience, a woman who had once brought a patient with a ruptured uterus at 28 weeks out of the operating room, alive, and written a paper about the case that was taught at 3 medical schools. She wasn't incompetent. That was precisely the problem. She was good enough to know that she didn't understand what was happening, and she hadn't slept in 38 hours. People could tell by the way she held her pen. She gripped it so tightly that the tip of her thumb had turned white, and every time she wrote a number on the board, the nib made a dry, tearing sound. 3 diagnoses were written there: sepsis, HELLP syndrome, fulminant preeclampsia. All 3 made sense. All 3 were wrong in exactly one place. Bertrand Lowell, 58 years old, wearing a burgundy bow tie, with 214 published papers and a habit of mentioning that number within 4 minutes of shaking someone's hand, stood up for the 9th time that morning to defend the diagnosis of sepsis. He had an argument. Lactate at 6.2, elevated white blood cells, falling blood pressure, coagulopathy. Everything fit, he said. Everything fit perfectly. Hartigan asked him only one question. What about the 3 negative blood cultures? Lowell replied that as many as 40% of sepsis cases failed to grow bacteria in culture, and he was right. And he had answered that question 4 times over 3 days with that exact figure, and not once had the answer made anyone in the room feel any relief, because there was one thing no one could explain. Maeve Vaughn hadn't deteriorated gradually. She'd collapsed in 90 seconds. The chart was clear. At 11:14, she had still been able to speak with the paramedic. By 11:15 and 30 seconds, her blood pressure had fallen below 70, and her fibrin degradation products had surged to a level so high that the laboratory had to rerun the sample. Sepsis didn't do that. Sepsis needed time. LLP needed time. Preeclampsia needed time. Whatever was killing this young woman needed nothing at all. It came like the flick of a switch. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, the argument had stopped being medicine and had become something else. The doctor from Cleveland refused to sign the note written by the doctor from Baltimore. A hepatology specialist flew in at 6 o'clock in the morning, reviewed the records for 2 hours, then said plainly that he had nothing to contribute and flew home. There was a moment when Lowell used the word idiopathic, and Hartigan set down her pen, looked at him for a very long time, then said that idiopathic wasn't a diagnosis. Idiopathic was what people wrote on paper when they had stopped thinking. No one said anything after that. Hartigan was afraid. She couldn't hide it from herself, even though she managed to hide it from everyone else in the room. She was afraid because, for the first time in 19 years, she was standing before a body that was dying in a way that appeared in nothing she had ever read. And she was afraid because outside in the hallway stood a man who never shouted, never threatened anyone, but simply remained there. And his silence carried more weight than any words could have. The only person in the room who hadn't said a word in 3 days was Teddy Vance. 30 years old, a 4th-year obstetrics resident, he had been included on the team because someone was needed to take notes and run errands. And that was exactly what he did. He wrote. He didn't ask questions. He had learned during his first year that in rooms like this, the youngest person to speak was the person who had the most to lose. But he had a habit no one knew about. He stayed past the end of his shift. He stayed because the 6th floor was quiet at night, and in the quiet he could think. And every night, sometime close to 1 o'clock in the morning, a woman pushed a supply cart down the hallway, stopped in front of the on-call cabinet, replenished the gauze and syringes in their proper places, spoke to no one, and looked at no one. Teddy noticed her not because she did anything unusual, but because every time she passed the consultation room, her footsteps slowed for exactly half a beat. Then she kept going. 3 nights in a row, the same half beat. He didn't think anything of it. Not yet the woman pushing the supply cart was named Nell Brannigan. She was 29 years old, and she wasn't an employee of Ashcroft Ellery. She worked for Aveline Staffing, a personnel agency with an office on the 2nd floor of a building in Long Island City, above a locksmith shop. Her title was patient care technician, $22 an hour. No insurance because the company kept her at 29 hours a week, exactly 1 hour below the required threshold. And that wasn't a coincidence. It was the business model. She took the R train to work from Ridgewood, Queens, 47 minutes each way when the train ran on time, and the R train never ran on time. Her job was very specific and very limited. She changed bed linens. She helped patients turn over. She measured pulse, temperature, and blood pressure, then entered the numbers into a tablet. She pushed the supply cart and restocked the duty cabinets with gauze, syringes, and medical tape. She didn't mop floors. People often assumed she did because her rented uniform was the same color as the uniforms worn by environmental services. But environmental services was a different department, represented by a different union, and if Nell touched one of their cleaning carts, both sides would be written up. Boundaries in a hospital were drawn with great care. They only blurred when people looked down from above. She took the night shift because nights paid an extra $2 an hour, and she accepted weekend shifts because weekends paid 3 more. There were $280 in her bank account. She was $180,000 in debt. That number never went down because the interest consumed money faster than she could pay it, and she had stopped looking at it the way people stopped looking at a scar. Rent was $1,400, electricity, train fare, and $190 every month for Finn's inhaler, because the cheaper kind made his hands shake so badly that he couldn't hold a pencil. Finn was 16. He had suffered from bronchial asthma since childhood, the kind that stole 2 weeks of school from him every winter. The kind doctors described as well-controlled, when what they really meant was that it wouldn't kill him, only that he would never be able to run a full lap around the field. He stayed home alone from 10 o'clock at night until 7 o'clock in the morning. He didn't complain. He didn't ask why they had nothing. Every evening at around 9:30, while Nell was on the train, her phone vibrated once. "Did you eat?" 3 words, no question mark, because he knew she wouldn't answer truthfully. She typed back yes, or "I already ate," or "I ate in the cafeteria." In her pocket, she usually carried a packet of saltine crackers taken from a patient's meal tray, the kind people left untouched on the table, and she ate them standing up in the elevator somewhere between the 4th and 6th floors. That was dinner. There was one thing about Nell Brannigan that no one at Aveline Staffing noticed, because no one had any reason to notice it. She accepted every shift at Ashcroft Ellery, every single one. When the coordinator called her at 2 o'clock in the morning asking whether she could cover an opening at Mount Sinai, she said no. Bellevue, no. A private hospital in New Jersey, offering $4 more, no. But if it was Ashcroft Ellery, she accepted, even split shifts, even double shifts, even on days when she had already worked 12 hours. And the phone rang at 5 o'clock in the afternoon asking whether she could come back. She always came back. She registered with the staffing agency under her middle name, Awifi, counting on the fact that a high-end hospital's automated payroll for night shift contractors never cross-referenced historical legal disputes. To the system, she was just a faceless barcode. To Ashcroft, she was invisible. The coordinator thought she needed the money. She did need the money, but that wasn't the reason. And there was one more thing, something people had noticed. The night nurses called it Miss Brannigan's strange little ritual. At the end of her shift at 6 o'clock in the morning, after everyone else had gone out the door, Nell remained in the staff lounge, sitting at the farthest corner of the table, and took out a leather-bound notebook. The cover was cracked at the corners, the spine had been repaired with electrical tape, and inside was something one nurse had once glimpsed over Nell's shoulder, and later described as looking like a code. The handwriting was so small that a person had to squint. Hand-drawn diagrams of the coagulation cascade, some of them drawn and redrawn 3 times over the same lines. Dosage charts. Arrows connecting a symptom in the left column to a mechanism in the right. And that mechanism had appeared in none of the textbooks the nurse had ever studied. Nell wrote for about 40 minutes. Then she closed the notebook, slipped it into her back pocket, and left to catch the R train home, arriving just in time for Finn to wake up for school. She had never shown that notebook to anyone, not once. Not a single page. The notebook contained 18 months. But what lay on page 61 was something she had been carrying inside her for 6 years. It all began with a word Nell should never have spoken aloud. 12:47 in the morning. At that hour, the 6th floor was the quietest place in the building. The air conditioning ran in night mode, its hum lower and deeper, and the hallway lights had been dimmed by half according to protocol so the patients could sleep. Nell pushed the supply cart past the nurse's station, nodded to the nurse bent over her screen, and stopped in front of duty cabinet number 3. She opened the top drawer. Sterile gauze went on the left, arranged by size, the largest packs underneath. 10-milliliter syringes went in the center compartment. Securing tape went in the right. She did this every night, and she did it without looking, her hands knowing where everything belonged the way people knew the road home. About 13 feet away, the consultation room door stood partly open. It hadn't fully closed once in the past 3 nights, because too many people kept going in and out, and the self-closing hinge had been blocked by the leg of a chair that no one had bothered to move. Through the gap, white light stretched across the hallway floor in a long, narrow band, and voices came with it. The first voice belonged to Bertrand Lowell, the voice of a man who had repeated the same sentence too many times, and was beginning to resent everyone for refusing to be convinced. Lactate at 6.2. White blood cell count at 19,000. It's sepsis, whether any of you want to admit it or not. The second voice belonged to a younger man with a Boston accent. But the blood cultures were negative 3 times. 3 times, not once. The third voice was Priscilla Hartigan's, dry and exhausted, with something beneath the exhaustion that she was trying not to reveal. What kind of infection drops blood pressure in 90 seconds and triggers disseminated clotting immediately afterward? Tell me. What infection does that? The cart stopped. Nell didn't remember stopping it. She was still holding a packet of gauze, her thumb pressed against the corner of the paper wrapper. She had heard that question for 3 nights. She had heard it beside duty cabinet number 1, beside duty cabinet number 2, in the hallway outside imaging. For 3 nights, she had walked past that door, and for 3 nights, she had managed to do the thing she had practiced for 6 years. The thing she did better than anyone else in that building. She had remained silent. But there was something different in Hartigan's question that night. She wasn't asking to argue. She was truly asking. She was asking like someone standing before a locked door, knowing that someone was dying on the other side. A silence of 3 seconds settled over the room. No one answered her. 14 of the finest people in America, and not one of them answered her. And the word escaped Nell, the way a cough escaped the body. There was no intention behind it, no preparation. She didn't even realize she had spoken until the sound was already hanging in the air. Amniotic. The strip of light from the doorway still lay across the floor. Inside the room, chairs scraped backward. 3 heads turned toward the hallway. Hartigan was the one who came to the door. She pulled it wide open, and the white light spilled fully into the corridor, over Nell's rented blue-gray uniform, over the supply cart, over the packet of gauze in her hand. Hartigan looked at her, not at her face, at the cart. "What did you just say?" Hartigan asked. Nell set the gauze down. She had 4 seconds to say nothing and turn away, and the past 18 months had taught her that it was the only sensible thing to do. She didn't do it. "Amniotic fluid embolism," she said. "The prodromal phase. This isn't an infection. It's an anaphylactoid reaction. Her body is reacting to fetal antigens entering the maternal circulation, and that reaction happens within seconds, not hours, which means it matches her 90-second collapse, while no infection does. The blood cultures weren't negative 3 times because the growth medium failed. They were negative because there were no bacteria at all, and every quart of crystalloid fluid you're putting into her is diluting what remains of her clotting factors, so her fibrinogen will keep falling no matter what else you do." She stopped. No one in the room spoke. Hartigan didn't move. Her fingers were still wrapped around the doorknob. "You're treating her exactly by the book," Nell said. "The book is wrong for this case. Bertrand Lowell was the one who broke the silence, and he did it by leaning back until the chair creaked beneath him, then laughing. It wasn't the polite kind of laughter people used to fill an awkward silence. This was the kind of laughter that filled a room and hollowed out a human being. It came from deep in his stomach, rose to the ceiling, occupied every inch of space, and when it finally stopped, there was no air left in the room for anything else. He wiped the corner of one eye with his index finger. "Did the night shift technician just diagnose Rourke Vaughn's sister?" he said. 2 others laughed with him. One was the young doctor with the Boston accent, and he laughed because Lowell had laughed, the way a man laughed, when he was still trying to find his place in a room filled with people older than he was. The other was a critical care specialist from Philadelphia, and he laughed because in 3 days, it was the only funny thing that had happened. None of them looked at Nell while they laughed. That was the detail she would remember most clearly afterward. They laughed in her direction, not with her. She wasn't a person in the story. She was the story. Hartigan didn't laugh, but she didn't stop them either. She remained there for 2 more seconds, one hand still resting on the doorknob, her eyes fixed on the rented uniform. During those 2 seconds, something passed over her face that Nell saw and no one else did, because no one else was watching her. It wasn't contempt. It was closer to recognition. It was the expression of someone who had just heard an answer that fit and was calculating what it would cost to admit it. Then she removed her hand from the doorknob, turned away, and walked back toward the board. She picked up the pen. She continued writing the number she had left unfinished. That was her answer. The door remained open because the chair leg was still wedged beneath it, and Nell stood in the strip of white light spilling into the hallway, like someone left standing on a stage after the performance had already ended. Rourke Vaughn arrived 4 minutes later. He didn't walk quickly. He moved at the pace of a man who knew that no one would begin anything before he arrived. At the nurse's station was a monitor divided into 6 screens, and one of those screens showed the 6th-floor hallway, and Rourke had sat in front of that monitor for 3 nights, because it was the only place in the building where he could see the door to his sister's room without standing directly outside it. He had seen Nell stop the cart. He had seen Hartigan open the door. He hadn't heard a word. He stopped exactly 1 step away from Nell. No farther. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Do you know what happens to people who sell me hope and then fail to deliver it?" he said. The words were spoken so quietly that the nurse sitting 20 feet away heard nothing. Nell didn't step back. She didn't lift her eyes to look at him either, because her gaze was level with his collar and she saw no reason to look up. "I'm not selling anything," she said. "I only said what I saw." A silence followed. During that silence, Rourke Vaughn studied her longer than anyone in that building ever had, and he didn't find what he was looking for. He was searching for fear, because fear was something he knew how to handle. He was searching for calculation, because calculation always had a price. He found neither. "Get off this floor," he said. She pushed the cart away. She didn't look back. At 2:10 in the morning, her phone vibrated. It wasn't Finn. It was the coordinator from Avalanche Staffing, a woman named Rhonda who worked the night shift in Long Island City, her voice drowsy and apologetic. The facility had requested a reassignment, no reason given, effective immediately. Basement 2 lay 36 feet below ground. There was no travertine down there. The floor was pale gray linoleum, the kind installed in the 90s, cracked along the baseboards, and curled back at the corners to expose the black adhesive beneath. The main corridor ran from the supply room, past the laundry where industrial dryers operated 24 hours a day and kept the air perpetually humid and unpleasantly warm, then ended at a set of double doors with no sign, because people didn't make signs for morgues. 14 fluorescent lights lined the ceiling. The 9th fixture from the entrance had a faulty ballast. It flickered every 8 seconds. Nell parked the supply cart against the wall, opened the first bin, and began arranging the gauze. 6 years earlier, Nell Brannigan had stood in this very building on the 6th floor, exactly 17 steps from duty cabinet number 3. She was 23 that year. She was a registered nurse, 11 months out of school, working at a public hospital in the Bronx, and proud of her employee badge in the way only someone newly graduated could be proud. She wasn't a midwife. That was the most important detail in this entire story, and at the time she didn't know it. Her mother's name was Fiona Brannigan, 46 years old, a librarian at the public library branch on Grand Concourse Avenue. 22 years behind the same desk, knowing the name of every child who came in on Friday afternoons to read comic books for free. She wore floral blouses, not one, but all of them. Her entire wardrobe was flowers, tiny blossoms against blue fabric, large blooms against yellow, and Nell used to tease her that she dressed like a curtain. Every afternoon, she walked home with a stack of books tucked against her side, always under her left arm, because her right hand had to remain free to wave at people she knew. She laughed easily. She laughed as though the world had just whispered a secret she had known for years, and she still found it funny. At 46, Fiona Brannigan became pregnant for the 3rd time. It wasn't planned. She laughed when she told her children. A baby girl. The doctor used the words high-risk pregnancy and told her she should give birth at the best place available, and the best place was Ashcroft Ellery. And Nell used nearly all her savings, together with the insurance coverage, to bring her mother here. On the day of admission, she stood in the lobby with its travertine floor and thought, "Good, nothing can happen here." The delivery was normal for the first 3 hours. Then it wasn't. Nell stood outside the glass doors of the delivery room because she was family, and family stood outside the glass doors. She saw the blood pressure fall. She saw her mother say something and then stop speaking. She saw the on-call team rush inside, and through the gap in the door, she heard the term they used, uterine atony, and she heard them call for uterotonic medication, and she knew immediately that they were wrong. She knew because she had studied it 3 months earlier during a lecture, where she had been the only person who stayed behind to ask more questions. The drop in blood pressure came before the bleeding. That was the wrong order. With uterine atony, the bleeding came first, and the blood pressure fell afterward. Here, it was the opposite. The opposite meant it wasn't the uterus. The opposite meant the lungs, the heart, something entering the circulation and making the entire body react at once. She pounded on the glass. She screamed. She screamed the same words she would speak 6 years later in the 6th floor hallway, and she screamed them 3 times. A nurse came out, blocked her path, and told her in the kindest voice in the world that she needed to calm down, that the team was doing everything they could, that she should sit down. Nell said she was a nurse. The other nurse looked at her, and there was no cruelty in that look, only a truth so simple it was merciless. She was a nurse, not a physician, not a midwife, and she was standing on the wrong side of the door. She had no authority. She only had the right answer, and not one person in the world was obligated to listen to it. 11 minutes. From the moment the blood pressure fell until they stopped chest compressions, 11 minutes. The baby died with her. In the waiting room at the end of the hallway, 10-year-old Finn sat in a plastic chair with a comic book open across his lap, his legs swinging without touching the floor. He saw nothing. All he saw was his sister come out of the hallway, take 4 steps, then drop to her knees on the travertine floor, as though someone had pulled the bones from her legs. He didn't understand. He wouldn't understand for another 30 minutes. He still had that comic book to this day. The death certificate read, "Postpartum hemorrhage, cause undetermined." Nell had read that line so many times she could reproduce every stroke of the handwriting. Cause undetermined was how medicine wrote down the sentence it wasn't permitted to say aloud. We don't know, and we've stopped looking. Fiona died in the 11th minute. Nell spent the next 6 years trying to find what might have been done in the 9th. Teddy Vance couldn't sleep, and he knew exactly why. It wasn't because of Lowell's laughter, though it stayed under his skin for the next 2 hours. It wasn't because of the way Hartigan had turned her back, though he would remember that image for a very long time. It was because of the word. He lay on the narrow couch in the on-call room, one arm draped across his eyes, and replayed it in his mind for the 20th time. Amniotic. She hadn't said it the way people offered a theory. People offered theories by lowering their voices at the end, by slipping in the word perhaps, by leaving themselves a way out. She had said it flatly, one clipped word, the way a surgeon said scalpel, the way a pilot said mayday. That wasn't the voice of someone guessing. It was the voice of someone naming something she had already seen before, and then there were the 4 sentences that followed. He had written them down. He had written them down because he was the one taking notes, because that was his job. And his hand had continued moving across the tablet while everyone else laughed. 4 sentences, not one unnecessary word. The sequence was right, the terminology was right, and the statement about crystalloid fluid, the final statement, was something no technician in the world could have said, because it wasn't memorized knowledge, it was a consequence. A person had to understand the mechanism before they could deduce that consequence. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Teddy sat up, opened his computer, and typed into PubMed. He tried the first combination and found nothing. The second brought back 400 useless results. He entered a third combination, narrower this time. Amniotic fluid embolism, prodromal phase, early intervention protocol, collapse in under 2 minutes. 11 results. He read them from top to bottom. 4 were isolated case reports. 2 were literature reviews written in the evasive language he had learned to skim past. The 7th result made him stop. A clinical case series published a year prior in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. 9 cases. The title described the exact sequence Nell had spoken about in the hallway. Blood pressure collapse first, immediate coagulopathy, negative blood cultures. He opened the full text. The page appeared with a red banner stretching across the top, white letters declaring that the article had been retracted. He stared at that red banner for about 5 seconds. Then he scrolled down to the author's name. N. Brannigan, certified midwife. Teddy sat perfectly still. The only sound in the on-call room was the computer fan. He clicked the retraction notice, waited for it to load, and read the single line it contained. In this field, retraction notices always stated who had withdrawn the paper and why. An author withdrew it after discovering an error. A journal withdrew it after finding plagiarism or fabricated data. Those were the 2 possibilities. He had read dozens of notices like that during his 4 years of residency. The words on the screen belonged to neither, retracted at the request of the institution. He read it again, not the author, not the journal, the institution, the hospital. A hospital could ask a journal to erase a paper about a life-saving technique, and the journal could agree, and no one had to explain another word. There was no rebuttal, no author's note, nothing at all. Only a name removed from the record and a red banner across the top of the page. Teddy opened a new tab. He entered the full name into the New York State Office of the Professions License Verification Database. That ugly blue website every physician in the state had used at least once. He typed Brannigan. He typed Nell. The result appeared in 2 seconds. Midwifery license. Issued status, revoked. Reason, practicing beyond the authorized scope. Teddy read that line 3 times. He knew the phrase. It sounded grave, and it could mean almost anything, from prescribing a drug outside an approved list to performing surgery in a parking lot. It was the drawer where licensing boards placed the things they didn't want to describe in detail. He scrolled farther down, to the complaint record, to the line naming the person who had filed it. He scrolled, then stopped, and in that moment Teddy Vance felt the back of his neck turn cold. Willem Ashcroft, 61 years old, chief medical officer, the man whose name was on the building where Teddy was sitting. The service elevator took 40 seconds to reach basement 2. And Teddy Vance spent every one of those 40 seconds wondering what he was doing. The doors opened onto a wave of warm, humid air from the laundry room, the smell of industrial detergent mingling with the damp odor of concrete. He followed the corridor. The 9th light flickered just as he passed beneath it, went dark, then came back on. 8 seconds later, it did the same thing again. Nell stood in front of the supply room with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, moving gauze from a carton onto the shelves. She worked quickly and evenly. She didn't turn when she heard his footsteps. Down here, people could always hear footsteps coming from nearly 50 feet away. "Your name is N. Brannigan," Teddy said. Her hands didn't stop immediately. She finished placing the box she was holding, then the next one, then a third. On the 3rd box, her hands stopped. "My name is Nell," she said, her eyes still on the shelf. "I work the night shift." "That paper describes exactly what's happening to Maeve Vaughn," Teddy said. Every word of it. The sequence of collapse, the negative blood cultures, the fibrinogen falling before anything else has time to change. "I just finished reading it. Then I read the retraction notice." Nell turned around. It was the first time in 3 nights that she had looked directly into anyone's face inside that building, and Teddy had prepared himself for one of 2 things. He expected anger, because she had every right to be angry. Or he expected pleading, because that was what people did when they were given one final chance. There was neither. There was only exhaustion in her eyes, not the kind that came from lack of sleep. It was the weariness of someone who had carried something unbearably heavy over a very long distance, who had stopped hoping anyone would offer to help carry it, and who still hadn't put it down. "I was the one standing outside the door, watching my mother die from exactly the same thing," she said, "on the 6th floor. About 36 feet directly above where you found me." She wiped her hands on her pants, reached behind her, and pulled the notebook from her pocket. The leather cover was cracked at the corners. The spine was repaired with electrical tape. She opened it without counting and turned directly to one page. Page 61. Teddy looked down, and for the first 2 seconds he couldn't read anything at all. He saw only a sheet covered in dense writing. Then his eyes began separating the layers. There was a diagram across the upper half, 3 branches extending from a single point, each marked with the name of a drug and a dosage. Atropine, ondansetron, ketorolac. Arrows connected each medication to a therapeutic target, and beside every arrow was a line of tiny handwriting explaining why. The lower half contained a timeline measured in minutes, from 0 to 10. And in the bottom right corner, written in red ink and underlined twice, was a sentence that belonged to no medical document anywhere in the world. "Mother's case, same progression, 9 minutes." Teddy didn't ask what the line meant. He understood immediately. "These 3 drugs are in the 6th floor duty cabinet," Nell said. "All 3 of them. About $40 altogether. But don't begin there. Begin somewhere else." She placed one finger against the margin of the page. 3 tests," she said. "First, fibrinogen. Not the standard coagulation panel, just fibrinogen by itself, because it's the first thing to fall and it falls the farthest, and none of you have ordered it once in 3 days. Second, a bedside echocardiogram to look for acute right ventricular failure. No one has done one because you're all thinking about the abdomen. Third, a pelvic MRI. That one isn't for diagnosis. It's to know what will happen before anyone opens her abdomen." She withdrew her hand. "If I'm wrong, you lose nothing," she said. 3 negative tests and you go back to sleep. If I'm right, she lives." Teddy took out his phone. He looked at her for 1 second, as if asking permission, and she didn't nod, but she didn't close the notebook either. He photographed page 61. The light flickered at the exact moment he pressed the button, blurring the first picture, so he took another. He put his phone away. Then he asked the question he had been carrying in his mind since leaving the on-call room. "Why didn't you appeal?" Nell closed the notebook. She slipped it into her back pocket. With what? She said. Ashcroft has his name on the building. I have an R train ticket at 5:12 in the morning. Teddy Vance opened the electronic medical record system at the 6th floor nurses' station and typed 3 words into the order field. Fibrinogen, standalone, stat priority. He entered his code, the system asked for confirmation, and he clicked yes. The entire process took 11 seconds. There was no one he needed to consult because he didn't need anyone's permission. A 4th-year resident in the state of New York had the authority to order laboratory tests for any patient on his list. And Maeve Vaughn was on his list because he was the one documenting the case, and the person documenting the case had their name on the chart. It was a small gap in the hierarchy of that building. It existed because no one had ever imagined that someone might one day use it. He printed the blood draw requisition, carried it downstairs, and stood there watching the technician fill the tube. Then he returned to the on-call room, sat down, and found himself unable to do anything for 1 hour and 28 minutes. At 6:40, the telephone in the on-call room rang. It wasn't the automated results system. It was a real person. The laboratory only called in person when a value had fallen into the critical range, because protocol required verbal confirmation, a recorded response, and the name of the person receiving it. Dr. Vance, I need you to repeat the number back to me. Teddy said the number. The person on the other end repeated it, 68 milligrams per deciliter. In an average person, fibrinogen ranged from approximately 200 to 400. In a woman during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, the body raised it naturally because childbirth was a bleeding event, and evolution had prepared for that. The normal range during pregnancy was 350 to 650. Maeve Vaughn had 68. That wasn't a low value. Low was 200. Low was 150 when people began to worry. 68 wasn't low. 68 was the number of a system that had ceased to exist. Teddy took the printout from the machine at the nurse's station and realized his hand was shaking when the paper made a rustling sound. He had to lay it flat on the counter before he could read it. Over 3 days, 14 of the finest people in America had ordered approximately 200 tests for this patient. A comprehensive metabolic panel 3 times a day, blood cultures 3 times, liver function, kidney function, procalcitonin, lactate 6 times, computed tomography scans of the chest and abdomen, a standard coagulation panel, PT, INR, APTT, every one of them, and all 3 values had been mildly abnormal in the particular way values became mildly abnormal in someone developing a clotting disorder, enough for people to mention them in a note and move on. No one had ordered a separate fibrinogen level. Not once. It sat in the same system, 1 click away, cost $42, and in 3 days, not one of those 14 people had thought to click it. At 8:15, Teddy borrowed a bedside ultrasound machine from the emergency department. He told one lie, that he needed it to check for pleural fluid, and the nurse there pushed the machine upstairs for him without asking another question. He entered the room. He applied the gel. He placed the probe beneath the breastbone and angled it upward, searching for a 4-chamber view. The image appeared after 4 seconds. He looked at it, and he didn't need anyone to explain what he was seeing. The right ventricle was enlarged, larger than the left ventricle, something that should never be allowed to happen in a living person. And the interventricular septum, the wall that should have curved toward the right, was being forced back toward the left, compressing the left ventricle into a distorted shape that every physician in the world learned during the 2nd year of medical school and never forgot. The D sign. It meant the pressure on the right side was higher than the pressure on the left. It meant the lungs. It meant something had obstructed the pulmonary circulation, and the heart was destroying itself trying to force blood through. It didn't mean sepsis. It had never meant sepsis. Teddy held the probe there longer than necessary. Then he printed the image, 2 copies, and turned off the machine. When he stepped back into the hallway, Yvette Marsh was standing in the doorway. 35 years old, the head nurse on the night shift, the only person in the building who called Nell by her first name instead of calling her the technician. She was holding the fibrinogen result Teddy had left behind at the station. She didn't ask what he was doing. She handed him the paper and said only 1 sentence, her voice as ordinary as though she were talking about the weather. No one has thought to order this test since the moment she collapsed. Priscilla Hartigan read the result for exactly 4 seconds before looking up, and during those 4 seconds, Teddy Vance understood that she had known what the number meant before her eyes even reached the bottom of the page. "Who authorized you?" she said, not loudly. She wasn't someone who raised her voice. "I did," Teddy said. "On whose recommendation?" This was where Teddy could have lied. He had thought about it for the entire 40 minutes it took him to return to the 6th floor. He could have said he found it in the medical literature. He could have called it clinical intuition, a phrase vague enough that no one could trace it. He could have said anything, and Hartigan would have accepted it, because what mattered to her was the number, not where it came from, and he knew that. But he had stood in this room for 3 days. He had listened to the same argument 40 times. He had watched a specialist fly in from Cleveland and fly home again because he had nothing to say. He had watched Lowell answer the same question with the same number 4 times. And he had watched Hartigan ask a genuine question close to 1 o'clock in the morning, and not one of the 14 people in the room had been able to answer her. He was tired of the circle. "The night shift technician," he said. Hartigan's face didn't change for exactly 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds lasted long enough for Teddy to hear the ventilator through the wall. Then it changed, and somehow didn't change at all. It collapsed in layers, slowly, like a building demolished from its foundation. The first layer was disbelief, a slight narrowing of the brow, the way someone frowned upon hearing a foreign sentence that sounded almost familiar. The second was offense, and it appeared in her chin, in the way her jaw tightened, because she was Priscilla Hartigan. She had 19 years and 31 published studies behind her, and she had just been informed that someone in this building had thought of something she hadn't. The third layer came last, and it was worse than the first 2 combined. It was contempt. "You ordered a test on Rourke Vaughn's sister," she said, based on the medical opinion of someone who pushes a supply cart. 68, Teddy said. He placed the second sheet on the table. The ultrasound image, a black and white 4-chamber view. Enlarged right ventricle, displaced interventricular septum, the D sign. "Look me in the eye and tell me that number, and this image fit any diagnosis written on that board. Any one of them. If you can, I'll go downstairs and apologize to her for wasting your time." Hartigan didn't look at him. She looked at the image, and Teddy, standing 3 feet away, saw something he would never forget afterward. She wasn't weighing the medicine. The medicine was already settled. It lay neatly on 2 sheets of paper, and she had finished reading it in 6 seconds. What she was weighing was a different calculation. If she followed the recommendation and it was right, the record would show that the diagnosis had come from a contract technician, and the 14 names on the consultation sheet would have to live with that sentence. If she followed it and it was wrong, she would have wasted Rourke Vaughn's money and time on a joke, and he wouldn't forget. If she did nothing and the young woman died, then the death would be idiopathic, a tragedy, something signed by 14 people, and not one of them would have to pay a price. She knew what the number meant. She had known from the moment she picked up the page. What she was calculating wasn't whether it was right. What she was calculating was what she would lose if it was. Hartigan set the image down on the table. She did it slowly, carefully, placing it precisely in the center as though the position of the paper mattered. "Order the MRI," she said. "Pelvis. I'll sign it." Teddy didn't say thank you. He knew this wasn't a gift. "And Dr. Vance," Hartigan said after he had turned away. He stopped at the door. "If you go behind my back again," she said, her voice still not rising at all, "I'll strip you of your residency credentials before lunch. Not by the end of the day. Before lunch. You'll lose 4 years, and I'll lose 4 phone calls. Do you understand?" "I understand," Teddy said. Then he went down to imaging to schedule the scan. At 1:47 in the afternoon, Teddy Vance pushed open the door to the imaging department waiting room, and Rourke Vaughn was standing there. No one else was in the room. The imaging technician had stepped outside, and Teddy understood immediately that she hadn't left of her own accord. This was her idea, Rourke said. Teddy didn't answer. He could have said no. He could have said it was Dr. Hartigan's order, which was true on paper. He said nothing, and his silence was louder than any answer he could have given. Rourke gave one very slight nod, the kind of nod made by a man who had just received confirmation of something he already knew. Then he took out his phone. Teddy prepared himself for security to arrive within 30 seconds. That wasn't the call he heard. "Cormac," Rourke said. "Find everything on Nell Brannigan, BRA2NSIGAN, contract technician, Aveline Staffing. I want to know who's paying her." He ended the call. He said nothing else to Teddy. He walked out of the waiting room, and 40 seconds later, the imaging technician returned, looked at no one, and began preparing the machine. There was something Teddy Vance didn't understand and wouldn't understand for many weeks. He thought Rourke Vaughn was standing in the way. He thought this was the arrogance of a wealthy man refusing to listen to someone poor. That was how a 30-year-old resident saw the world. Rourke Vaughn saw the world differently. In his world, there was a rule he had learned at 19 and had never once seen proven wrong. When 14 experts couldn't explain something, and a person with nothing suddenly explained it with perfect precision, the only reasonable interpretation wasn't that this person was smarter than the other 14. The reasonable interpretation was that this person had known in advance. And someone who knew in advance about the thing killing his sister, in the language Rourke Vaughn had spoken for 18 years, could only be the person who had put it inside her. He didn't allow the MRI because he believed Nell. He allowed it because if the result came back exactly as she had predicted, he would have proof that she knew things no one was supposed to know. He wasn't opening a door. He was setting a trap, and the trap would only close if its prey was right. At 3:22 in the afternoon, the images appeared on the screen. The radiologist sat motionless for 30 seconds, then called Hartigan. Maeve Vaughn's placenta wasn't resting against the uterine wall. It had grown through it. It had eaten through the full thickness of the uterine muscle, passed through the serosal layer, and attached itself to the back wall of the bladder, growing into it, merging with it, and it had been growing there for weeks. In medicine, it was called placenta percreta. It wasn't so rare that no one knew about it. It was rare enough that an obstetrician might encounter it only a few times in an entire career and remember everyone. What it meant was very simple and very cruel. If someone opened her abdomen and tried to remove the placenta the way it had been removed in countless cesarean deliveries before, the placenta would tear away part of the bladder wall with it, and Maeve Vaughn would bleed to death on the operating table in 3 minutes, not 30. 3. Hartigan stared at the images and said nothing for a very long time. 3 tests, fibrinogen at 68, the D sign, and now this. 3 out of 3. The woman who pushed the supply cart had correctly predicted all 3. Blind bud from the hallway, after overhearing 2 sentences through a partly open door. At 4 o'clock, Nell's phone vibrated in basement 2. It was an automated text notification from the hospital's security portal. Her temporary access profile had been flagged and permanently deleted by administration. Effective immediately. No, it wasn't a dismissal, only the end of the assignment. No, they hadn't given a reason. Please leave your badge at the security desk. Nell set the box of gauze in her hands on the shelf. She placed it exactly where it belonged, arranged by size, the way she did every night. She wiped her hands on her pants, reached behind her to make sure the notebook was still in her pocket, then picked up her coat. She didn't ask why. She left through the loading entrance at the back of the building, the door reserved for supplies and waste, because the main entrance required a badge, and hers had stopped working 4 minutes earlier. She didn't argue. She didn't scream. She walked 2 blocks to the R train station, descended the stairs, and sat on the wooden bench at the far end of the platform. She didn't board the train. 4 trains passed. She remained there. Above her, roughly 36 feet vertically and 2 city blocks away, Maeve Vaughn had about 8 hours left. At 11 o'clock that night, Cormac Deal walked into the small room on the 6th floor that Rourke had taken over as his place to sit for the past 3 days, set a file on the table, and spoke before Rourke had a chance to ask. No one is paying her, Rourke. She owes money. Rourke didn't touch the file. He looked at Cormac. How much? 180,000, Cormac said. Federal student loans. The interest is growing faster than she can pay it down. She has $280 in her account. Rents in Ridgewood, $1,400 a month, paid on time for 22 straight months. No credit cards, no car, no second account, no safe deposit box, nothing. If someone is paying her to do this, they're paying her in something I can't find, and Rourke, I always find it. Rourke opened the file. The first page was a copy of a bachelor's degree in nursing from 2019, issued by a public college in the Bronx. The second page was her professional record. Registered nurse, 3 years at a public hospital. The third page made him stop. Columbia University. Master's degree in midwifery. Enrolled in 2021, graduated in 2023, first in her class. Attached was a copy of a letter from the department chair to the scholarship committee. 3 handwritten lines saying that in 20 years of teaching, she had never encountered a student with clinical instincts like this candidate. She went back to school, Cormac said. 30 months, studying while she worked. She owes that money because of that degree. The next page was the paper, a clinical case series, 9 patients, published in 2024. Cormac had printed the citation statistics as well. 31 citations in 14 months, Cormac said. For a paper written by a newly graduated midwife, that isn't merely a lot, it's unusual. A group in Toronto is testing her protocol again on their own patients. They emailed her 4 times. She answered all 4. Rourke turned to the next page. Cormac continued, his voice slowing, and Rourke recognized it as the voice Cormac used when he had already read what came next and knew what was waiting. Late in 2024, Cormac said, night shift at Ashcroft Ellery. A 22-year-old patient named Rosalind Teague. State insurance, not a private wing patient. She collapsed on the delivery table, the same kind of collapse. 90 seconds. The physician on call wasn't in the building. He was at his daughter's wedding in Westchester. He told them to call him back in 20 minutes. Cormac placed one finger on a line in the report. Nell Brannigan didn't call back in 20 minutes. She ordered 3 medications, administered them herself, and signed her own name in the log. 27 years old, a certified midwife, no physician within 12 miles, and she did exactly what she had written about in her paper 1 year earlier. Rosalind Teague lived. Rosalind Teague's baby lived. She still lost her license. Rourke looked up. 3 weeks, Cormac said. 3 weeks after that night, a complaint was filed with the New York State Office of the Professions, practicing beyond the authorized scope. That meant a midwife could deliver a baby, repair a perineal tear, prescribe medications from a defined list, but the 3 drugs she administered that night weren't on that list. Technically, the complaint was correct. That was what made it clean. The review panel had 3 members. 2 of the 3 had once been students of the person who filed the complaint. No one disclosed that, because no rule required them to. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Cormac turned to the transcript, and he had marked the passages that mattered in pencil. She brought everything, Cormac said. The raw data from all 9 cases in the paper. Her own case log from that night, minute by minute. Rosalind Teague's fibrinogen chart, before and after treatment. She even brought the letters from the Toronto group. For 4 hours she presented it like a dissertation. Rourke looked down at the transcript, and what did he bring, he asked. Cormac was silent for a beat. He brought himself, Cormac said. He presented no data. He challenged none of her numbers. He sat there and said that in 30 years, he had never seen a case where breaking the boundaries of professional scope ended well, and that if the board allowed this, they would be opening a door no one could ever close again. That was all. That was his entire argument. The board chose him. There's 1 more page, Cormac said. He turned to the back of the file and pushed it toward Rourke. I found this at 9 o'clock tonight, and I sat with it for an hour before bringing it up here. The final page was a product brochure. Heavy paper, printed in full color, the kind of brochure hospital systems received by the hundreds every year. At the top was the Ashcroft Ellery logo and a centered line of text. The Ashcroft Protocol, launched in 2025. Rourke read it. It isn't a patent, Cormac said. The law in this country doesn't grant patents for methods of treatment. No one is allowed to own a way of curing someone, so he didn't take that route. He packaged it as something else. A 2-day certified training program. It came with a software module that plugged into the electronic medical record system, automatically issued an alert when certain values fell into a specific pattern, and recommended an intervention. Sold as a complete package. Annual licensing fee. Cormac tapped 1 finger against a line at the bottom of the page. 40 hospital systems have bought it. 40. That means hundreds of facilities. It means money coming in steadily every year without anyone having to do another thing. And last October, the American Association of Obstetrics and Gynecology gave him an award for his contribution to maternal safety. There's a photograph. He went up on stage. People rose to their feet and applauded. Rourke turned the page over. He placed the product brochure beside the printed copy of the retracted paper. He read them both. Then he read them again, more slowly. Cormac said nothing while he did. The 3 medications listed in the brochure were the same 3 medications on page 61. The same order, the same window of time. The diagram in the software module was the same diagram from the 2024 paper, except it had been redrawn with vector graphics in colored blue. The language had been rewritten from beginning to end, every sentence changed, every term replaced with longer, more formal words, the order of presentation rearranged. But beneath that new skin was the same skeleton, the same way of thinking. The same person had created it, and that person wasn't the one whose name appeared on the page. He didn't merely destroy her, Cormac said. He needed to destroy her. If her paper had remained in the journal with her name on it, then what he sold the following year would have been stolen work, and anyone could have discovered that in 4 minutes. So the paper had to disappear first. Then the license had to disappear, so that if she ever spoke, she would only look like a bitter woman whose credentials had been revoked. He didn't do 2 things, Rourke. He did 1 thing, and it had 2 steps. Rourke closed the file. Then he set it down on the table. Cormac Deal had stood beside this man for 19 years. He had seen Rourke receive bad news in every form it could take. He had watched him learn that someone had betrayed him without changing his expression. He had sat beside him in a car after something neither of them would ever mention again, and Rourke had talked about the weather. But he had never seen him set anything down so gently. There was no sound. The file touched the table without making a single noise. Cormac would rather have seen him throw it against the wall. He stood there and felt cold spread down his spine, because he knew what that gentleness meant. It meant Rourke had stopped feeling and started calculating. "Rourke," Cormac said, "there's one more thing." Rourke didn't look up. "Do you know who the second largest shareholder in this institute is?" "Silence. You are," Cormac said. "Hollis Group, for 6 years. It's buried beneath 3 layers of intermediary companies, so your name doesn't appear anywhere on paper, but it's us. We send money through this place every quarter. We paid for the stone floor in the lobby. We paid for the imaging machine they used on Maeve this afternoon. And in 2025, when this institute sent out the complaint that destroyed the life of a 28-year-old midwife, part of the salary paid to the lawyer who drafted it came from your money. Rourke Vaughn had spent 18 years building a wall between Maeve and the world he lived in. He had calculated every minute, every distance, every road, and that world had found his sister, not with guns, not with men, but through the very invoices he had personally approved every quarter for 6 years. At 11:48 that night, the black Maybach stopped outside the R train station on 4th Avenue, and Cormac Deal opened the rear door, but Rourke stepped out before he could make his way around the car. He descended the stairs. At that hour, the platform was nearly empty, with only a man asleep at the far end, and an insurance advertisement with one corner torn away. Nell Brannigan was still sitting on the wooden bench at the end of the platform, exactly where she had been since 4 o'clock that afternoon. The knees of her rented uniform were still damp, because, before her badge stopped working, she had knelt to wipe up a spill in the supply room and hadn't had time to change. The notebook rested on her lap. She hadn't opened it. In the 7 hours she had been sitting there, she hadn't opened it once because there was no reason to. She knew every page by heart. Rourke didn't open the car door for her. He didn't tell her that someone was waiting upstairs. He walked to the bench and sat down about 3 feet away from her on the same wooden plank. The most powerful man on the East Coast sat on a subway station bench close to midnight, his elbows resting on his knees, staring straight at the tracks. A train passed in the opposite direction. Neither of them spoke until the noise had completely faded. "You saved Rosalind Teague," Rourke said. "I know," Nell said. "You lost everything because of it, I know." He turned his head and studied her face in profile. She didn't turn toward him. She kept looking at the tracks, and there was nothing on her face, none of the bitterness he had expected, none of the quiet pride of someone who had just been proven right. "Why did you stay and work the night shift at the place that killed your mother?" he asked. "There are 37 hospitals in this city. You could have gone anywhere." Nell was silent for a moment. Then she answered in the same ordinary voice someone might use to answer a question about the train schedule. "Because Ashcroft Ellery is the only hospital in this city that keeps enough whole blood in storage. Not packed red blood cells. Whole blood. Every other place stopped keeping it in the 90s because it's expensive and expires quickly. This place keeps it because they have the money and because they accept high-risk maternity patients. That protocol doesn't work without whole blood. You can have all 3 medications and still lose the patient, if all you have is packed red blood cells. So if it ever happened again to someone somewhere in this city, it could only happen here. And I wanted to be inside the building when it did. Rourke remained still. You waited 18 months, he said, for a patient you had never met. Yes, Nell said. He had heard many answers in his life. He had listened to people lie to him with admirable skill. He had heard people tell the truth because they were afraid. He had learned to distinguish between the two when he was 20. And what he measured wasn't the content of their words, but what lay beneath them, the thing they wanted from him. Everyone wanted something. That was the only constant in his life. Sitting beside this woman, he couldn't find it. There was nothing. She didn't want money, because she had sat there for 7 hours instead of going out to find another job. She didn't want her name cleared, because she hadn't mentioned her license once. She didn't want revenge, because if revenge had been what she wanted, she could have let everything happen, and stood by while the Institute drowned in the lawsuit brought by the Vaughn family. She wanted nothing at all. She was simply sitting at the end of a subway platform, waiting for a train she had no intention of boarding. Do you know who I am? Rourke asked. It was the question he always used. It wasn't truly a question. It was a measuring stick, and he had measured hundreds of people with it, and every one of them reacted in one of two ways. They were afraid, or they pretended they weren't, which was even easier to read. Nell Brannigan turned her head. It was the second time in her life that she had looked directly into his face, and this time she held his gaze longer. You're the brother of a 24-year-old woman who is going to die before sunrise, she said. Beyond that, I don't care who you are. The sound of a train came from the southern tunnel, the shriek of steel wheels entering the curve, still far away. Rourke Vaughn sat on that wooden bench and realized something he had nowhere inside himself to place. In 18 years, he had never met anyone who looked at him and didn't see a threat. Not one person. Not even Cormac. Not even Maeve somewhere very deep inside, in the place she had chosen not to look. But this woman didn't. She had weighed him, set him down, and moved on. Rourke stood up, adjusting his coat against the subway chill. Let's go, he said quietly, extending a hand to help her up. My car is waiting outside. Nell looked at his hand, then at the tracks, and finally stood up on her own. Minutes later, the black Maybach was tearing through the midnight streets back toward Manhattan. At 12:04 in the morning, the elevator doors opened onto the 6th floor, and they were already standing there. Hartigan, Lowell, 12 others in white coats, and behind them, a man in a gray suit who wasn't a doctor, holding a hardcover folder against his chest, the hospital's on-call attorney, who had been awakened at 11 o'clock that night and had driven in from Scarsdale to stand there. Bertrand Lowell stepped forward. His bow tie was still perfectly straight. This person's assignment was terminated at 4 o'clock this afternoon, he said. She isn't an employee. She has no license to practice. Her credentials were revoked last year, and anyone can verify that in 2 minutes. He turned toward Rourke, and his voice changed, becoming less theatrical, and because of that it carried more weight. Mr. Vaughn, I'm not talking about ethics. I'm talking about the law. If this person touches your sister inside this building, the Institute's liability coverage becomes void immediately, and if anything happens, not $1 will be paid. The Joint Commission will revoke our accreditation within 90 days, and she will be prosecuted for practicing medicine without a license, a Class E felony carrying up to 4 years in prison in this state. I'm not threatening her. That's the law. Anyone can look it up right now. This was the moment Nell understood that the barrier in front of her wasn't arrogance. It was the truth. Lowell was right, every word of it. She spoke, and she spoke calmly, without raising her voice, loudly enough for the entire hallway to hear. I don't need a license to speak. I need a licensed physician willing to sign the orders. I won't touch her. I won't hold the syringe. I won't hold the knife. I'll stand at the foot of the bed and say the sequence, and one of you will do it. I'll give directions. Someone else will hold the knife. If that still breaks the law, put my name in the report and I'll sign it. Then she turned toward Hartigan. The physician stood 2 steps away, holding nothing in her hands, and she hadn't spoken a word since the elevator doors opened. I'm not asking you to believe me, Nell said. I'm asking you to look at the number 68 and tell yourself that you know what it means. You knew from the moment you picked up that page 6 hours ago. You don't lack knowledge. You just don't want it to come from me. Hartigan didn't answer. The door to the room opened. Rourke went in first, and Nell followed. and no one stopped her because no one knew how. Inside, Maeve Vaughn lay on the bed like something shaped by hand rather than born. Her skin was the color of wax. Her lips were blue around the edges. Her belly was still there, round and alive, and that was the cruelest thing in the room. On the monitor, her blood pressure was 68/40, oxygen saturation was 84. And along the lowest strip, the fetal heart rate was 92, and Nell watched it for 4 seconds and saw it fall to 91. She walked to the bedside. She didn't touch Maeve. She stood there, looking down, then raised her head and looked directly at Rourke Vaughn. "I can save them both," she said. "Her and the baby. I'm not saying I'm certain. I'm saying I can, and that's more than anything those 14 people have told you in 3 days. But I need 4 minutes, and during those 4 minutes, you can't interfere for even 1 second, even when it looks as though I'm killing her. Because that's exactly what it will look like. Her blood pressure will fall lower than it is now. Alarms will sound. There will be a moment when you think I'm making it worse, and you'll be right to think that, and you'll still have to stand still." "What do you want?" Rourke said. It was the only question he knew how to ask. It was the question he had asked everyone for 18 years, and not once had there been no answer. "Nothing," Nell said. "I only need you to trust me." Rourke looked at her. It was the look under which people had signed away companies, the look that had made 2 grown men confess things they had never told their wives. He held it for 3 seconds, 4, and she didn't move, and she didn't look away, and in her eyes there was no fear, no ambition, nothing he could buy, hire, or take away. There was no handle anywhere. "All right," he said. Then he turned toward the hallway and spoke his next sentence no louder than the one before it. "Anyone who stands in her way stands in mine." No one moved. That was power, and everyone knew it, and it still solved nothing, because power couldn't sign a medical order. A very long beat passed. Then Priscilla Hartigan stepped into the room on her own, without anyone telling her to. She went to the computer beside the bed and opened the chart. "I'll sign the orders," she said. "The responsibility is mine." Nell looked at the clock on the wall and fixed the time in her mind. "Minute 0. Stop all crystalloid fluids," she said now. A nurse turned toward her as though she had spoken in a foreign language. "Her blood pressure is falling." "I know," Nell said. "Stop them." Her voice didn't rise. There was no emotion in it at all. It was the voice of someone reading a grocery list. Hartigan nodded to the nurse, and the nurse's hand closed the valves, stopping all 3 intravenous lines at once. "Whole blood," Nell said. 4 units, not packed red blood cells. The blood bank has it. I know it does. Inventory code 402. 10 units of cryoprecipitate running at the same time through a separate line. Start both now. Atropine, 1 milligram. Ondansetron, 8 milligrams. Ketorolac, 30 milligrams. Intravenous push. At the same time, not one after another. At the same time. Lowell stepped through the doorway. "Ketorolac," he said, and this time there was no laughter in his voice. "She has disseminated intravascular coagulation. Her fibrinogen is 68. You're planning to give a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug to someone with a fibrinogen level of 68. You'll make her bleed to death." Nell didn't turn around. She was watching the monitor. "Ketorolac blocks thromboxane," she said. "Thromboxane is what's constricting her pulmonary vessels and killing her right ventricle. What will kill her in the next 10 minutes isn't bleeding. It's right heart failure, yes. This drug is contraindicated on paper. On paper, she's already dead." She finished speaking, and no one said another word. The nurse looked at Hartigan. Hartigan said one word: "Push." 50 seconds. Blood pressure 52/30. The alarms began screaming. 2 machines at once, making the sound everyone in medicine hated more than anything, because it left no room for thought. Oxygen saturation fell to 79. At the doorway, Rourke Vaughn took 1 step into the room. He didn't think. His body moved before he had time to decide, and in 18 years, no one had ever touched him without permission. Cormac Deal raised 1 arm and pressed it across Rourke's chest. He said nothing. He simply held his arm there, knowing that if Rourke chose to keep moving, that arm wouldn't stop him for even 1 second. And still he held it there. Rourke stopped. He had promised her 4 minutes. Inside his head, a clock was running, and he hated it more than anything he had ever hated. 1 minute 30 seconds. Nell turned toward Hartigan. "We operate here," she said. "We don't move her to the operating room. The trip will take 4 minutes, and she doesn't have 4 minutes." Hartigan shook her head once, firmly. "No." She pointed toward the wall monitor, where the magnetic resonance images were still displayed. "The placenta has invaded the bladder. You've seen this. The moment we open her abdomen, she'll lose 2 liters of blood in 90 seconds. I won't operate on someone with a fibrinogen level of 68 and placenta percreta beneath a ceiling light with no blood bank beside me. Then we don't remove the placenta, Nell said. We leave it where it is. The entire room froze. It was the one idea none of the 14 people who had passed through that room over the previous 3 weeks had considered. Not because they didn't know it, but because it lay outside instinct. Every obstetrician in the world was trained in the same sequence from the first day. Deliver the baby, remove the placenta, then allow the uterus to contract and stop the bleeding. That was the order. That was what the body wanted. Leaving the placenta inside defied everything their hands had learned over 20 years. A classical cesarean, Nell said. Don't make a low transverse incision. Make a vertical incision through the upper body of the uterus, above the upper edge of the placenta. You'll see that edge on ultrasound. It's approximately level with the navel. Deliver the baby through that incision. Don't touch the placenta. Don't separate it, pull it, or disturb even 1 millimeter of it. Cut the umbilical cord close to the placenta and leave the rest inside. Then close the uterus with the entire placenta still intact within it. She won't hemorrhage because we won't disrupt that plane. As long as the placenta remains attached to the bladder, the seal remains closed. What kills the patient is trying to remove it. Hartigan looked at her. Then she'll still have an entire placenta percreta inside her abdomen, she said. Yes, Nell said, and you'll perform the hysterectomy later. Planned. With enough people, enough blood, a urologist standing beside the table, in a real operating room when her fibrinogen is above 150. That's tomorrow. Tonight's job isn't to cure her. Tonight's job is to keep her alive until you can. Hartigan stood motionless for exactly 2 seconds. Then she reached for a pair of gloves. The anesthesiologist was a 38-year-old woman named Adeline Quarry, and she had been standing at the head of the bed for the past 40 seconds without doing anything. The atropine syringe was in her hand. Her hand was trembling. Nell looked at her. Then she looked more closely, and something shifted across her face, something very small, the first thing that had moved on her face all night. You were on duty the night my mother died, Nell said. Quarry didn't deny it. She spoke one sentence, almost too quietly to be heard, and only 3 people in the room caught it. I read your paper. In 2024, I read it 3 times. And then what did you do? Nell asked. I did nothing. There was a beat. 1 single beat, shorter than a breath. Then do something now, Nell said. Push the atropine. Her hand stopped trembling. She pushed it. 2 minutes 40 seconds. The baby was born, and there was no sound at all. There is a kind of silence that exists only in a delivery room and nowhere else in the world. It isn't the absence of sound. It is the absence of one particular sound that everyone in the room is waiting for. And when it doesn't come, every other sound, the machines, the breathing, the touch of metal against a tray, suddenly becomes twice as loud. Teddy Vance carried the baby to the resuscitation table. No heartbeat, he said. No pulse. The atropine crossed the placenta and suppressed her, Nell said. Give me 30 seconds. Bag her. No epinephrine. Don't touch the epinephrine. 3 minutes 5 seconds. Nothing. Teddy squeezed the bag steadily, once every 2 seconds, and his face had gone white. A nurse placed her fingers against the cut end of the umbilical cord and shook her head. 3 minutes 12 seconds. Nothing. 3 minutes 20 seconds. Nothing. Outside, beyond the glass partition, Rourke Vaughn stood with both palms pressed against the glass. He didn't pound on it. He didn't shout. He simply stood there with both hands against the glass, his breath fogging a small circle in front of his face. This man had commanded a city. He had commanded ports, buildings, men carrying guns, and now he stood there unable to command a pair of lungs no larger than his own fist to open. 3 minutes 30 seconds. 3 minutes 35 seconds. Nell didn't look at the baby. She watched the clock. She had counted 64 seconds since the child had left her mother's body, and she knew her limit was 90. And she knew everyone in the room was waiting for her to change her mind. 3 minutes 44 seconds. A cry came, small, choked, furious, the kind of fury that belonged to something dragged away from the only warm place it had ever known. It broke into the air, and it wasn't beautiful, and it was the finest sound anyone in that room had ever heard. 4 minutes. A nurse read the results from the machine. Fibrinogen at 68, then 91, then 140. Blood pressure 72/44, then 88/56. No one cheered, no one applauded. Nell Brannigan simply exhaled, That was all she did, and her left hand trembled once, only once, a brief shudder at the wrist, before she closed it into a fist and held it still against her side. "Keep going," she said. "Don't change the rate." At 7:12 in the morning, Maeve Vaughn opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling first. Then she turned her head, and she saw the machines. And she saw her brother sitting in the chair beside the bed with both hands pressed against his forehead. Then her gaze moved farther, toward the woman standing beside the window in a wrinkled blue-gray uniform. "Who are you?" Maeve asked. Her voice was like paper. "I'm the night shift technician," Nell said. Maeve's eyes left her face. They stopped at the windowsill, where a leather-bound notebook with cracked corners and a spine repaired with electrical tape had been resting for some time without anyone noticing. Then they returned to Nell. "No," Maeve said. "You aren't." They brought the baby to her. Tiny, red, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes closed. Maeve couldn't lift her arms, so they laid the child on her side in the hollow between her shoulder and her neck. She looked at her for a very long time. Then she whispered a name, and she whispered it to the baby, not to anyone else in the room. "Fiona." Nell Brannigan didn't move. Not a single muscle in her body moved. No one in the room understood what had just happened, because to them it was only an Irish name shared by half the grandmothers in Brooklyn. Only one person understood. Rourke Vaughn lifted his head from his hands and looked at her, because he had read Cormac's file from beginning to end, and he knew her mother's name. "Wait, let me stop here for a moment. 18 months spent arranging gauze in the basement of the very building that had taken her mother, her license, and her name from her own paper." They laughed in her face. They drove her out through the loading entrance, and she still came back. "Could you have done that?" "Be honest." "I don't think I could have." 3 days later, Rourke Vaughn withdrew every dollar Hollis Group had invested in Ashcroft Ellery. He didn't do it quietly the way he had done everything else in his life. He attached a letter to the board of directors, and that letter contained exactly one sentence anyone remembered. "I'm leaving because I discovered that I was financing the burial of a woman, and that was what stripped away the shield." 3 days after that, Willem Ashcroft struck back. A criminal complaint was filed, practicing medicine without a license, a Class E felony carrying up to 4 years in prison. He didn't prosecute Nell because she was wrong. He prosecuted her because she was right. Because if she was right, then the protocol bearing his name and being sold to 40 hospital systems was stolen work. Cormac Deal offered the solution in the language of the world he knew. "Ashcroft has a loan I can buy in 40 minutes. Say the word." Work sat in the darkness for a very long time. Then he said no. "She spent 6 years doing everything the right way, and the system crushed her. If I save her my way, I prove the system was right. She doesn't need me to save her. She needs to be seen." He did 3 things, and all 3 were legal. He hired a Manhattan law firm and paid 5 years in advance. He hired an independent forensic auditing firm to compare the 2 documents, and they identified 17 passages with matching structures of argument, with no possibility that the similarities were accidental. And he didn't testify. Maeve did. A 24-year-old piano teacher holding her daughter sat before the board and said, "This woman practiced medicine without a license on my body. I'm not here to accuse her. I'm sitting here because of her." The audit uncovered something no one had expected. Willem Ashcroft had used institutional funds to silence other whistleblowers who tried to expose his stolen medical work. Rourke's investigators uncovered a massive paper trail of corporate fraud and systemic bribery that Ashcroft had coordinated to keep his medical monopoly secure. Ashcroft didn't confess to anyone, but that night, Rourke called his own attorney and transferred all financial guardianship of little Fiona into an independent trust completely severed from Hollis Group's medical investments. He stared out the window and whispered to the empty room, "That child will not grow up on tainted money." The criminal complaint was dismissed. Nell's midwifery license was restored, and the decision from 2024 was overturned, with a finding that the complainant had failed to disclose a conflict of interest. 40 hospital systems canceled their contracts. The award was revoked. Ashcroft resigned before the hearing. Priscilla Hartigan intended to resign, but Maeve wouldn't allow it. She stayed, and she learned from the woman she had nearly allowed to die in her hallway. Bertrand Lowell stood before the entire staff, his bow tie hanging loose, and spoke her full name, Nell Awif Brannigan, then used a title he had never used for anyone wearing a rented uniform, midwife. 6 months later, the Fiona Brannigan Foundation was established with $40 million. It wasn't Rourke's money. His name appeared nowhere, and he held no seat on the board. The founding director was Nell Brannigan. Its first program provided free training to midwives at 300 smaller hospitals, places that would never have 14 physicians, places where there might be only one nurse and a clock. Because the thing that saved Maeve Vaughn cost $40 and was already sitting inside the duty cabinet of every hospital in the country. The missing thing had never been the medicine. The missing thing was someone willing to listen. Nell's office stood exactly 30 steps from the maternal recovery room, the place where she had once been forbidden to stand. 3 things hung on the wall: a photograph of a red-haired woman in a floral blouse standing outside a library in the Bronx, a stack of books tucked against her side, her restored license, and the cracked leather notebook opened to page 61 and mounted behind glass. That page had saved the sister of the most powerful man in New York, but it had never been written for anyone powerful. It had been written for a mother no one had saved. Rourke stood in the doorway of her office. "You know who I am," he said. "I know. And you still allow me to stand here." Nell looked down the hallway, where Maeve was approaching with Fiona in her arms, and Finn was walking closely beside her, his arms carefully reaching out to support the baby, with a protective, mature gentleness. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, "I've spent my entire life being looked at by people who saw nothing but my uniform. I won't do that to you. But if you want to stand in this hallway, you have to earn the right to be here, every day, just like the rest of us." Rourke nodded once. Then he stepped aside so the little girl could pass. And perhaps that is the true lesson of this story. We live in a world accustomed to measuring human worth by the things people wear, by the title printed on a badge, by the car parked outside. But dignity isn't something handed down from above. It already exists within every human being, including the person wiping your table, delivering your food, or standing behind a counter while you hurry past without ever looking at their face. Real respect isn't an act of charity. It is the willingness to stop for half a second and listen until someone finishes speaking. And sometimes, choosing to listen just once is enough to change an entire life. The next time you pass someone pushing a supply cart at 3 o'clock in the morning, remember this. You don't know their story. You don't know what they are carrying. And you don't know what they know. If this story touched you, please press the like button, share it with someone you believe needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you can enjoy compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever been judged by the uniform you wore, or have you ever unknowingly judged someone else that way? Please leave a comment. We truly want to hear what is in the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video excellent health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.